Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, Ugandans turn out for a landmark election amidst an internet blackout. Former pop star Bobi Wine takes on President Yoweri Museveni's 35-year rule following a bloody campaign in which the leader's opponents were regularly targeted. Also, at least 80 people are killed in a raid on a village in western Ethiopia. Ethnic clashes elsewhere in the country have escalated amidst a security vacuum that followed federal troops' campaign in the northern Tigray region at the end of last year. And Thursday marks 10 years since Tunisia's Jasmine revolution, which saw the toppling of former leader Zine El Abidine Ben Ali following a wave of protests. A decade on, the country has been held up as a rare example of democratic progress, but frustrations continue. But first, counting is underway in Uganda after voters turned out for the 10th presidential election amidst an internet blackout. Former pop star Bobi Wine is hoping to ride a groundswell of support from young Ugandans and unseat longtime leader Yoweri Museveni. He remains the frontrunner, though. After 35 years, he's seeking a sixth term in office. The campaign was marred by violent crackdowns on his rivals and critics. Dozens of people were killed amidst fears that the process would not be free or fair. Most Ugandans have only known one president. Grania Harrington has more.
A real demographic story in this election. So 75-year-old President Museveni in power since 1986, running for a sixth term in power. 80% of Ugandans are under the age of 40. Most of Uganda has never known another president. Most of them were born after President Museveni came to power. So there's been a real shock to the system to have somebody who represents this young generation running against the president for the first time. In the past, it's been people who have defected from his party, who fought the Bush War that brought him to power originally, and candidates who were former friends and allies of the president who are running against him. So now this young contender who has managed to electrify the youth all over the country is running against him. Now, whether Bobi Wine's popularity, both as a singer and as a candidate with young people, translates into votes is a whole different story. I did hear in Kampala today, several people said to me that they'd seen a lot of young people coming out to vote. But it's very hard to get a clear picture of what's happening across the country because there's been an internet blackout.
Well, voting started late in some places as biometric machines were impacted by the internet shutdown that began on Wednesday night. Nanjala Nyabola is a journalist and the author of Digital Democracy Analog Policy, a book on Kenyan politics and the internet. She joins me now. Nanjala, when it comes to Uganda, it looks like the blackout affected the way that the polls were conducted. Do you think that this was an oversight on the part of authorities?
I don't know whether it was so much an oversight as it was collateral damage. I think that it was a failure to take the full impact of their decision under account. I feel like it seems like the opposition, the government had started with a soft shutdown, but basically by shutting down mostly social media and then sort of making VPNs illegal. And it sort of escalated as it seemed that the opposition was more and more determined to mobilize their supporters to get their people to come out to the polls. And now we see that they've implemented this internet shutdown without necessarily thinking through how it might affect, for example, the biometric voter registration, the voter identification, which is a critical part of delivering an election.
And how do you think the shutdown is going to affect the aftermath of the election?
It's difficult to say. I mean, the intention behind that, we can assume that the intention behind the shutdown was to be able to conduct, what we would call nefarious activities without any oversight. Other shutdowns in other parts of the world have basically been used as a cover for human rights violation, and sometimes at a scale that is difficult to comprehend until after the fact. The longest running internet shutdowns in the world in Kashmir and Cameroon have run 2 years, 280 days, 250 days. And in that time, we saw widespread human rights violations, arbitrary arrests and detentions and killings. So it's difficult to say what the human rights impact of the shutdown is going to be. But in terms of the digital rights, we are already seeing the impact of people being taken offline, being unable to stay in touch with family members and friends, being able to stay updated even with what's happening with the election. I mean, communications have suffered. Media is not able to communicate, and we've seen people sort of taking terse action against the Ugandan government. We've seen some very stern statements coming out against the internet shutdown because it's definitely having effect on people, the quality of people's lives.
Beyond Uganda, Ethiopia, Chad, Cameroon, as you mentioned, Sudan, Algeria, DR, Congo, Zambia. Just why have we seen so many internet shutdowns in Africa over the last 5 years or so?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think it's important to point out that it's not just Africa. The country that has shut down the internet the most in the world is India, and it happens routinely in Kashmir. But beyond that, I think it's becoming the preferred tool of authoritarianism because the internet has become such a potent site for organizing, especially oppositions, especially critics of the state. The internet has opened up new channels of communications, new ways of associating, new communities of belonging, and I think they undermine the authoritarian state because it has for a long time been a place where they can't impose themselves, where they can't control the conversation. And so the internet shutdown is basically that last-ditch resort of an authoritarian who basically has nowhere else to go. And I think they're becoming more common in part also because of the complicity of private corporations. It's not, the government that is switching off the internet at source. It is corporations that are being put pressure. The pressure comes from the state, but it is actually in African countries where most people are connecting through mobile phones. It's the mobile phone companies that are actually complicit in the act of switching off the internet.
Thanks very much. Nanjala Nyebola there speaking to us from Kenya about the current internet shutdown affecting Uganda on its day of voting. On another news, at least 80 people were killed in a raid on a village in western Ethiopia this week. Gunmen rampaged through the community in Benishangul Gumuz region along the border with Sudan. Ethiopian troops have been diverted across the country to the Tigray region, where federal troops have been battling local fighters. As a result, some ethnic clashes elsewhere in the country have escalated amidst the security vacuum. Maria Gerth Nicolescu tells us more.
Tuesday's attack is the latest massacre in the Benishangul Gumuz region in western Ethiopia. According to the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, at least 80 people were brutally killed in the Metakel zone of the region. According to eyewitnesses, victims include women, children, and elderly people, and the attack was carried out by members of the Gumuz ethnic group who were mainly targeting members of the Amhara and Agao ethnic groups who are minorities in the region. Massacres in the Benishangul Gumuz region have multiplied in recent months, mainly because of land disputes. On December 23rd, more than 100 people had also been killed in a similar attack right after the Ethiopian Prime Minister had visited the area in order to try and calm tensions. But this is only one of many major security threats across Ethiopia, with other regions, such as the Oromia region, also struggling with interethnic violence, and in the northern Tigray region, fighting is still ongoing between government forces and the Tigray People's Liberation Front.
Maria Gerth Nicolescu there for us. Now, 5 people were killed in a bombing in eastern Algeria on Thursday. It was the deadliest attack on civilians in the country in several years. The homemade roadside explosive went off in the region of Tebessa as a car drove by. No one has yet claimed responsibility for the attack. And Thursday marks 10 years since Tunisia's Jasmine revolution, which saw the toppling of former leader Zine El Abidine Ben Ali following a wave of protests. A decade on, the country has been held up as a rare example of democratic progress in the wake of the Arab Spring. But there is still widespread frustration amongst Tunisians that structural and economic problems have still not been sorted out. Our reporters went to meet 2 activists who took part in the uprising 10 years ago.
It's one of the many enduring images of Tunisia's uprising, one unemployed 21-year-old's way of speaking out against the Ben Ali system. A decade on, Wadi remembers the protests well.
مش وديع اللي يهز قفص 14 جانفي. الشعب التونسي كل الشباب كل الشعب التونسي يهز قفص 14 جانفي. حطيت فيه ضربه تحل باب القفص، طارت الحمامه، عباره على تحررنا، عباره كنا 23 سنه مربوطين في حبس، مقهورين مذلولين مفقرين مهمشين.
With the old regime gone, Wadi turned his hand to politics but swiftly became disillusioned. Now he's returned to activism.
10 سنين بعد الثوره ما تحقق حتى شيء، بالعكس زادنا التهميش، زادنا الفقر، زادنا الهم، زادنا بلاد داخله في حيط، الكبارات قاعده تسرق، اللي جاوا من برا اللي قالوا احنا شاركنا في الثوره، وينكم ماكم شاركتوا في الثوره؟ قلتوا ليه شاركنا حتى من بعيد وتكلمنا وعندنا جماعتنا وعندنا وينكم فما حتى شيء.
It was on the streets of Sfax's old town that Miriam lived out the revolution. These days she's a stylist but continues to campaign.
الثورة عمرها ما كانت لحظة، الثورة هي مسار كامل. إذا اليوم باش نحصرها في 10 سنوات كهو كأني سكرت الملف بتاع المسار الثوري. المؤكد إنه مازال مش يتواصل ومازال باش يكمل. عندي عادة سنوية، أنا كل سنة وين يجي ديسمبر نستحضر الفيديوهات الكل نرجع لهم. ريانكو باش نحاول اني نحافظ على النفس هذاك في روحي، معناها باش ما ننساش.
On the rooftops where she stages her shootings, Miriam says many of the hopes of a decade ago have become reality.
حاجز الخوف، معناها الثورة نحات لي حاجة ما عادش يهمني. مستعدة نعمل برشا حاجات لقدام. تشوف توا الحيوت الجرافيتي والكل كانها باهية ولا خايبة ماهوش مشكل، المهم اللي فما شبيبة تحب تبدل، تحب تحدث تغيير، تحب تعبر.
Encouraged by the transition to democracy or feeling let down by it, in their own ways, Miriam and Wadi are both hoping for a better future.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa for now. Thanks for joining us, and do so again if you can. Take care.
C'est le pays où j'aurais pu être, où j'aurais pu vivre. C'est celui que je mets quand on me demande mon lieu de naissance.
El Salvador. Mathieu was born there in the midst of a civil war. He was taken from his biological family and adopted by a French family. Thousands of Salvadorian children were victims of organized trafficking run by the army. A murky past buried for the sake of amnesty, included in a peace agreement. No trial, no war crimes, no opening of army archives. Entire episodes of history remain hidden. Hundreds of families are still searching for the truth. Don't miss El Salvador Revisited on France 24 and France24.com.